Welcome back. You're still watching Shape Your Life, the show that aims to teach you everything you need to know about health-related matters. The National Institute for Communicable Diseases conducts laboratory-based surveillance for a number of communicable diseases. Shape Your Life had a chance to spend time at their laboratory to find out more about the research that they do on viral infections. We're at the National Institute for Communicable Diseases to chat to Professor Puran about the virology department, what they do, how they do it, and how it impacts us as consumers in South Africa. Professor, thank you so much for your time and joining us on Shape Your Life.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about virology.
I think that's my first question. You led into it. What is virology and what do you do here at the NICD?
All right, so virology is really about the study of viruses. And as you know, viruses are unique in the sense that they're biochemicals that consist primarily of a nuclear protein. So you have some nucleic material and it's surrounded by a protein capsid, as it's called. You can get a bit more sophisticated than that, but that's the basis of what a virus is. So a virus can only survive if it infects a cell, a human cell, for example. Outside of that cell, it may survive for an hour or a few days, but subsequently, for it to propagate, it needs to be able to enter a cell, take over the machinery where appropriate, and propagate itself.
Wow.
So it's quite incredible, it's quite remarkable how some of these viruses are. They can range in terms of specific outcomes. You mentioned diseases, for example. So we know viruses are a major cause of infectious diseases every year.
Now you're busy with some interesting research in the virology department here. Please tell me about some of the latest trends that you've identified and what you are currently busy with.
Yes, so maybe I can just give you a bit of history about the National Institute for Communicable Diseases, because it's really important, because it started off actually what is called the Poliomyelitis Research Foundation. And so the Poliomyelitis Foundation came about in the late 40s, 50s to garner funds for vaccine development in South Africa. It was called, I think, the March of the Dimes. And from there, it later developed into what is called the National Institute for Virology. And subsequently, in 2002, it became the National Institute for Communicable Diseases. So we have multiple centers here at the institution, and they're a combination of epidemiology, microbiology, and virology. And it's really, if you like, a disease approach to that. So if you take the Center for HIV and STIs, we certainly focus on HIV, but also other viruses that cause STIs, such as herpes viruses, for example. And within this particular center, we have many focuses. One of the key focuses, obviously, is a vaccine for HIV. So part of my interest here is really to look at the endpoints of vaccine trials, because you really want to establish whether or not a vaccine is protective against HIV infection. So we measure the numbers of infections and then look in terms of the randomized controlled trial whether or not what is that ratio of those who become infected on the vaccine versus those that were on the placebo. But my colleague, for example, Lynn Morris, who's just a floor above me here, is looking at another aspect of those vaccine trials, which is called immune responses. And we're looking at what is called broadly neutralizing antibody responses, and that's become quite to the fore. In the early days, when you looked at the immune system, you can categorize it as so-called cytotoxic T cells and antibody responses, and there was a lot of focus on CTLs, and as they are then called, because it's thought that the HLA background was very important in driving responses to vaccines. But subsequent work has also shown that antibody and antibody responses are also really critical, and so some of these more recent trials are really focusing on what are called neutralizing antibodies. These are not common events, they're rare events, but they certainly have informed how vaccine trials have actually developed. And then a third colleague, yes,
amazing.
And then the third colleague, Caroline Timmerson, for example, is looking for a cure for HIV infections. Again, we have unique individuals that have become infected, for example, and really seem to control the viruses. And these are called either elite controllers, and within that are so-called long-term non-progressors. So it looks as if the virus is able to infect an individual, but the immune responses are such that they're able to control the virus. So you can either have undetectable virus, or you can have low levels of virus with well-maintained immune responses. So there's a whole host of interesting things that are being done here at the Institute.
When we look at viruses, do viruses change over a period of time, that we have to keep on adapting our research and technology to make sure that we're keeping up to trends with how they're developing, within how they affect human beings and how they affect others? Or do we identify a vaccine and that's the be-all and the end-all of it?
No, I think that's been, you highlight a very important point about viruses and their evolution. So some viruses may, for all intents and purposes, be relatively stable, in other words. So if you take measles, for example, we know that there's an effective vaccine that can control measles infections. And that's because if there were subtle changes on that virus will disappear. So in terms of the immune response, we know that that's relatively stable. There may be other subtle changes that are important, and are important from a surveillance perspective, but it's relatively stable in that way. But HIV, I remember it was one of the Secretaries of State in 1989 said, oh, we'll have a vaccine in 2 years. And look where we are now. Still several vaccine trials, some of which have failed, some of which have provided very important key information to us, is essentially because that virus, the HIV virus, changes so rapidly. So you can have what is called a founder virus. It will then diversify. And it's really trying to say, well, how does the immune response react to this? And how effective will it be? And we know that the antibody responses, the early antibody responses, are not really that effective. I mean, we can certainly use it for diagnostic purposes, but in terms of preventing further infections and poorer outcomes, it's not that great. So certainly viruses do adapt and do evolve very rapidly. And that makes, at least for HIV, as a good example, makes it very difficult for us to find a cure and a good response to that. Yeah.
But let's take it back closer to home for you as well, as being in the Institute right now. You mentioned that how it got started, that the seed was born out of polio awareness and developing a vaccine in South Africa. So let's revisit that to say that, has a cure for polio been found? And how is polio then transmitted, and we prevent those further infections or debilitating particular individuals?
Yeah, so I think vaccines are one of the cornerstones for prevention. And polio has been, I suppose, one of those, like measles and smallpox, been a virus that you can actually approach and develop an effective vaccine to eliminate polio in countries. So South Africa, for example, has eliminated polio since 1989. But we're slowly but surely getting to the point where we think that polio may well be eradicated. It's been a long and hard road. We know that there have been features other than the virus that has affected our responses to this virus, because we know we have fairly effective vaccines against polio. And so I think we are close to probably eradicating polio. And that, by eradicating, I mean worldwide there won't be any polio in circulation.
That's
so that'll be remarkable. News. So the transmission of polio, so there are 3 polio viruses that are critical, that have caused the disease that we see. And it's polio type 1, 2 and 3. Type 2 was eliminated probably in 1999. And so 1 and 3 have been the viruses that are still currently in circulation.
You mentioned something earlier, and that led me into my entrepreneurial brain, where you look at things like a very simple thing, not STIs, but obviously herpes plays a role in STIs, but also the herpes simplex around people's lips when they get the fever blisters that they then get. So you're dealing with, can you find a vaccine and a cure for that? Versus business, because I know of an organization in America that's developing a cream that could treat the fever blister quicker. And they said that if they capture 15% of the global market, it's $1 billion company overnight. So we're dealing with business versus what you're doing in the research to find a cure. That means business will suffer. How are you literally, buffering that to say that a cure is surely better than treating a fever blister, for example?
Well, I think we, in the old days, not necessarily the old days, I think there was that distinction between prevention and treatment. And I think the two are really at least when you look at HIV, I know we can come back to HSV, I think that separation becomes a bit artificial. So if you look at, for example, mother-to-child prevention in this country, treatment was really our prevention strategy. It's really been an effective way in which we could actually manage that. And so I think when you look at drug development, again, research institutions really started off that. So if you think about the first drugs for HIV, AZT for example, really was developed by a research institute and then taken over by pharmaceutical industries and so forth. So I think there's that close relationship and that investment into research institutes to really try and find novel ways in which we could manage infections.
I think with all the amazing information you've shared with us today, there are some of our viewers that are sitting there and saying, that's great and I understand it, but is there a cure for viral infections?
Well, it's quite interesting you mentioned that. So as you know, the common cold has been around always. And some people think that they may well have found a way in which they can manage that, and it comes back to a vaccine, and there may well be drugs. So I don't think there's a one answer to that. I think there are individuals who get infected. So let's take another virus like HCV, for example, hepatitis C virus, which can have severe sequelae 30 to 40 years later. But in some individuals, they get infected, it gets cleared. And again, what are the answers to that? You know, how does that happen? So yes, there may well be spontaneous cures. We have a common cold, it doesn't persist, so you get infected. We get flu, we have a seasonal type pattern, it goes away. But we also have vaccines to try and manage that. So I don't think there's a cure for everything. So HIV is a good example where we can certainly manage the disease, but it persists. And how do we get rid of those islets of infection? You know, and again, I think people are trying to work on that to reach the cure. And it depends on how you define cure as well.
I think it's amazing. Professor, thank you so much for your time, for joining us on Shape Your Life.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Dr. Scholl took time off his busy schedule to educate us about viral infections and treatment options available. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us on Shape Your Life.
Pleasure.
What is a viral infection?
So a virus is a small particle of genetic material, either DNA or RNA, and it usually comes packaged in a membrane, a membranous envelope. And once it invades certain cells of the body system, it will then cause an infection.
When we look at the difference between a virus and a bacteria, is there a distinct difference? And how can people break down how it affects us as individuals?
Yeah, so the differences are quite significant. So the structure of the virus, very different to a bacteria. Bacteria have cell walls, viruses don't. Bacteria usually can respond to antibiotic therapy. Viruses don't respond to antibiotics. They're very particular antiviral medications that work against viruses, and they cause very different clinical syndromes.
When it comes to viral infections, what are some of the common conditions that one could associate with a virus?
So probably in South Africa, our most common one is unfortunately HIV. And then we're all very familiar with the seasonal flu. Yeah. And there are a number of other viruses that we see quite commonly, like viral hepatitis. So hepatitis B, hepatitis C are also viruses that are very common in our setting.
What are the treatment protocols associated? Because you said we don't take antibiotics for it. What can we do?
It's very different depending on which viral infection we're talking about. So, for example, there are certain antiviral medications for let's say HIV or for hepatitis B. But for some other viral infections, like the viral infections that cause colds, there's no specific antiviral medication for them.
Do vaccines play a role when it comes to being preventative, when it comes to viral infections?
The one notable thing about viral infections is that there are a number of really useful vaccines that are excellent at preventing the development of viral infections. So even though our treatment options for viral infections are quite limited, the vaccine prevention for a number of them is really excellent. So for example, a seasonal flu vaccine, which is recommended for everyone every year.
When it comes to the virus itself and the vaccines, we always know that they say, the flu vaccine is not ready yet for next year.
Yes.
Does the virus actually evolve and build up resistance to a different strain of treatment or a different strain of virus? How does that actually work?
So it depends which virus we're talking about again. When it comes to the flu vaccine, that is always based on which strains are the predominant strains in the population for that season. They take information from the Northern Hemisphere. They look to see which are the common flu strains that happen in the Northern Hemisphere, and then we can predict or get an idea of which are going to be the strains that we are likely to encounter for winter next year.
One of the amazing victories, I would say, in your industry and in what you specialize in is, of course, over many years, is beating and finding a cure, so to speak, for polio. And a lot of children have been affected by that, over the last couple of decades. But it's slowly decreasing. What are your thoughts on this, and then what else can we expect when it comes to the polio research and literally eradicating it?
Polio is hopefully going to be considered one of the great success stories of modern medicine. We are inches away from eradicating an infection in our lifetime, which is not something that we have the pleasure of saying very often. Currently, as it stands, I think there are only 2 countries where there's active, what they call wild-type polio, where there's still active transmission of polio. It's, I think, Pakistan and Afghanistan. But for the most part, the rest of the world has essentially eradicated polio. So the major sort of driving force behind that has been the introduction of very successful vaccines.
Where to from here in dealing with viral infections, especially when you bring it down to South Africa? There's a lot of vaccinations that happen, amongst children. They have the schedule set out. I know, like, my daughter's in school, and at a particular age, you go in, this is what happens. Is that efficient for us as a society? And if not, what else can we do?
So as it stands, the number of vaccines covers only a certain number of viral infections. I think as doctors, we always prefer a public health approach where we would prefer to prevent infections from developing. So a lot of research is being directed into developing vaccines for a number of common viral infections that are still very prevalent in our population, but as yet don't have a vaccine directed towards them.
So there's so much more way to go, but we've come so far already.
Yes.
One quick final thing for you. I know many people that are suffering with what they phrase the summer flu. Okay, so they are sneezing, coughing and spluttering everywhere. And many of them now want to pop an antibiotic. Should they pop an antibiotic? Should they rather let it work through the system or be symptomatic in their treatment approach?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, because we are seeing a lot of people, even at this stage of the year, still getting winter colds and flu left over from the winter season. And we always advise to avoid antibiotics for viral infections, especially the mild upper respiratory tract infections like the simple cold.
That's good to know, and that's good advice straight from the doctor's mouth to our ears. Thank you so much for your time and taking time out of your diary to really share some insight and give us a deeper understanding on viral infections, which many people don't understand. They end up very confused around it, but you've given us clarity.
Thank you.
With the insights learned about viral infections from today's show, you need to be proactive in looking after your health, and your nutrition is important. So eat your vegetables and have your fruit. Don't forget that you can keep in touch with us by sending an email to shapeyourlife@ann7.com with all your health-related queries or topics that you would like seeing being discussed on the show. From me, Ronald Avergy, and the Shape Your Life team, see you next week.